Welcome to Just Stories. We hope you enjoy the story. 1982 Lebanon War, the Arab-Israeli conflict unfolds, by Just Stories. Chapter 1, Prelude to War, From Peaceful Beginnings to Military Confrontation. Welcome to the first chapter of our exploration of the 1982 Lebanon War. In this chapter, we will take a closer look at the events that led up to the conflict and the political and military strategies of both sides. The Arab-Israeli conflict has a long and complex history, and the 1982 Lebanon War was no exception. At its core, the conflict was about the future of the region and the competing interests of the various parties involved. In the years leading up to the war, the political situation in Lebanon was in flux. The country had been mired in a civil war since 1975, with various factions fighting for control. The conflict had taken a heavy toll on the country, and it was clear that something needed to be done to restore stability. Meanwhile, Israel had long been concerned about the presence of Palestinian militants in southern Lebanon. These militants had been launching attacks on Israel from across the border, and Israel saw them as a direct threat to its security. Against this backdrop, Israel began to plan for an invasion of Lebanon. The plan, known as Operation Peace for Galilee, was designed to eliminate the Palestinian militant threat and restore stability to southern Lebanon. On June 6, 1982, Israel launched its invasion, with ground troops crossing the border into Lebanon. The move was met with resistance from various factions in Lebanon, including the Palestinian Liberation Organization, which had established a stronghold in southern Lebanon. As the conflict unfolded, both sides engaged in a range of military tactics, including airstrikes, artillery barrages, and ground offensives. The fighting was intense and bloody, with casualties on both sides. For Israel, the invasion was seen as a success. The military had achieved its objectives, and the threat from Palestinian militants had been largely neutralized. However, the conflict would have lasting consequences for the region, and the legacy of the war continues to be felt to this day. In conclusion, the prelude to the 1982 Lebanon War was a complex and multifaceted series of events. The conflict was driven by a range of political and military factors, and both sides had their own objectives and strategies. While the invasion was successful in achieving its immediate goals, it would ultimately have far-reaching consequences for the region and the world. Chapter 2, The Siege of Beirut, a turning point in the conflict. Welcome to the second chapter of our exploration of the 1982 Lebanon War. In this chapter, we will take a closer look at the Siege of Beirut, one of the most significant and controversial events of the conflict. The Siege of Beirut began in June 1982, shortly after Israel's invasion of Lebanon. The city was home to a large number of Palestinian militants and was seen as a key strategic target for the Israeli military. The siege was a protracted and grueling affair, lasting for months and resulting in significant civilian casualties. The Israeli military used a range of tactics to isolate the city and cut off supply lines, including aerial bombardment and ground offensives. As the siege wore on, the humanitarian situation in Beirut became dire. The city was facing a severe shortage of food, water, and medical supplies, and thousands of civilians were trapped inside with no way out. In response to the crisis, international pressure began to mount on Israel to end the siege. The United States, in particular, played a key role in negotiating a ceasefire agreement between Israel and the PLO. The agreement called for the withdrawal of PLO forces from Beirut and the establishment of a multinational force to help ensure security in the city. The PLO agreed to the terms, and the evacuation of militants from Beirut began in late August. However, the evacuation was marred by controversy and tragedy. The Israeli military allowed Christian Falangist militias to enter the Palestinian refugee camps of Sabra and Shatila, where they carried out a brutal massacre of hundreds of civilians. The massacre sparked international outrage and led to calls for an investigation into the events. It also had a significant impact on the wider Arab-Israeli conflict, serving as a rallying cry for Palestinians and inflaming tensions in the region. In conclusion, the Siege of Beirut was a significant turning point in the 1982 Lebanon War. The protracted and grueling conflict resulted in significant civilian casualties and highlighted the humanitarian cost of war. The aftermath of the siege, including the Sabra and Shatila massacre, would have lasting consequences for the region and the world. Chapter 3: The Reagan Plan, Diplomacy and Negotiation. Welcome to the third chapter of our exploration of the 1982 Lebanon War. In this chapter, we will take a closer look at the Reagan Plan, a U.S. proposal for a ceasefire in the conflict. The Reagan Plan was put forward in September 1982, in the wake of the ceasefire agreement that had ended the siege of Beirut. The plan called for a withdrawal of Israeli troops from Lebanon and the establishment of a multinational force to help maintain security in the region. The proposal was seen as a major diplomatic breakthrough, with the potential to bring an end to the conflict and restore stability to the region. However, the plan was met with significant resistance from both the Israeli and Palestinian sides. The Israeli government, led by Prime Minister Menachem Begin, was initially skeptical of the plan. The Israeli military had invested significant resources in the conflict and was reluctant to withdraw without assurances of its security. Meanwhile, the Palestinian leadership, led by Yasser Arafat, was divided over the proposal. Some saw it as a potential path to peace, while others viewed it as a sellout of their cause. Despite these challenges, the Reagan Plan continued to be a focus of diplomatic efforts in the region. The U.S. government worked tirelessly to broker a ceasefire and bring the warring parties to the negotiating table. In the end, however, the plan was ultimately unsuccessful. Both sides were unable to reach an agreement, and the conflict continued to simmer for years to come. Nevertheless, the Reagan Plan represented a significant moment in the history of the Arab-Israeli conflict. It demonstrated the power of diplomacy and negotiation in resolving conflicts and paved the way for future efforts to broker peace in the region. In conclusion, the Reagan Plan was a bold and ambitious proposal for ending the 1982 Lebanon War. While it ultimately proved unsuccessful, it represented a significant moment in the history of the conflict and demonstrated the importance of diplomacy and negotiation in resolving complex international disputes. Chapter 4: Sabra and Shatila, the Aftermath of the Conflict. Welcome to the fourth chapter of our exploration of the 1982 Lebanon War. In this chapter, we will take a closer look at the aftermath of the conflict, with a particular focus on the Sabra and Shatila massacre. The massacre at the Sabra and Shatila refugee camps occurred in September 1982, during the final days of the Israeli siege of Beirut. The Israeli military had allowed Christian Phalangist militias to enter the camps, where they carried out a brutal massacre of hundreds of Palestinian and Lebanese civilians. The massacre was widely condemned by the international community and had a profound impact on the wider Arab-Israeli conflict. It served as a rallying cry for Palestinians and inflamed tensions in the region, further complicating efforts to achieve peace. In the aftermath of the massacre, there were widespread calls for an investigation into the events. The Israeli government initially resisted these calls, but under pressure from the international community, it eventually established a commission of inquiry. The commission, led by Israeli Supreme Court Justice Yitzhak Kahan, ultimately found that Israeli Defense Minister Ariel Sharon bore indirect responsibility for the massacre. The findings led to Sharon's resignation from his position. The aftermath of the massacre also had a significant impact on the lives of those who had survived. Many of the victims were left with deep emotional scars and struggled to rebuild their lives in the wake of the tragedy. In recent years, there have been renewed efforts to seek justice for the victims of the massacre. In 2013, a group of survivors filed a lawsuit against the Israeli government, alleging that it had failed to prevent the massacre and had violated their rights. The Sabra and Shatila massacre remains a painful and controversial chapter in the history of the Arab-Israeli conflict. It highlights the devastating human cost of war and the importance of accountability and justice in the aftermath of such tragedies. In conclusion, the aftermath of the 1982 Lebanon War was marked by the profound impact of the Sabra and Shatila massacre. The tragedy had far-reaching consequences for the region and the world, and it continues to be felt to this day. Efforts to seek justice for the victims and prevent such atrocities in the future remain ongoing. Chapter 5, Legacy and Lessons, Reflections on the War. Welcome to the final chapter of our exploration of the 1982 Lebanon War. In this chapter, we will take a closer look at the legacy of the conflict and the lessons that can be learned from it. The 1982 Lebanon War was a significant moment in the history of the Arab-Israeli conflict. The conflict had far-reaching consequences for the region and the world, and it continues to be felt to this day. One of the most significant legacies of the conflict was the toll it took on the civilian population. The fighting resulted in significant civilian casualties and displacement, with many families forced to flee their homes and communities. The conflict also highlighted the importance of international diplomacy and cooperation in resolving complex conflicts. The Reagan Plan, while ultimately unsuccessful, demonstrated the potential power of diplomatic efforts to bring warring parties to the negotiating table. At the same time, the conflict underscored the challenges of achieving peace in a deeply divided and volatile region. The Arab-Israeli conflict has proven to be one of the most intractable and complex conflicts in the world, with no easy solutions or quick fixes. Nevertheless, the legacy of the 1982 Lebanon War offers some important lessons for policymakers and leaders today. These include the need to prioritize the safety and well-being of civilians in times of conflict, the importance of international cooperation in resolving disputes, and the recognition that achieving lasting peace requires sustained and dedicated efforts over the long term. Looking to the future, there are reasons to be hopeful that progress can be made towards a more peaceful and stable Middle East. Recent developments, such as the normalization of relations between Israel and several Arab nations, offer promising signs that cooperation and dialogue can prevail over violence and conflict. In conclusion, the legacy of the 1982 Lebanon War offers important insights into the challenges and complexities of the Arab-Israeli conflict. While the conflict was marked by tragedy and suffering, it also demonstrated the potential for diplomacy and cooperation to achieve peace and stability in the region. As we reflect on the lessons of this conflict, let us remain committed to the pursuit of peace and justice for all people in the Middle East and beyond. Thank you for watching our story. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, so you don't miss out on our next video.